And welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Monday, December 13th. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. Many of the stories read here can also be found at our website at IndianCountryNews.com. And here are the news stories for the day from the Associated Press and other Native news sources. Jurors needed only about 4 hours to agree that John Graham and two other American Indian Movement supporters kidnapped a fellow activist in 1975 and killed her on the Pine Ridge Reservation of South Dakota, one jury member said. But they weren't all convinced it was Graham who pulled the trigger. After a second day of deliberations on December 10th, the 12 jurors convicted John Graham of felony murder during the kidnapping of Anime-Pictuaquash, whose death came to symbolize the American Indian movement and its often violent struggles with federal agents during the 1970s, but acquitted him of premeditated murder. Juror Barry Winter said that although he and 11 others came to a swift agreement Graham was culpable in Aquash's death, there was disagreement about his role. Arlo Looking Cloud, who was convicted in Aquash's slaying 6 years ago and is serving a life sentence, was the only witness who testified of seeing Graham kill Aquash. Looking Cloud said he stood nearby as it happened. The jury eventually decided there wasn't enough evidence to convict Graham, a 55-year-old Southern Shoshone Indian from Canada, of premeditation, Winter said. On the first count, we came to a fairly short resolution that he was guilty, Winter told the Associated Press. On the second one, that's what we spent a lot of time on. Lead prosecutor Marty Jackley, the state's attorney general, said the felony murder charge carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison. Jackley said that last Friday he wasn't sure whether parole was even an option. Prosecutors said the activist who kidnapped and killed Aquash believed she was a government spy, which authorities have denied. As South Dakota Judge John Delaney read the verdict December 13th, as he read the verdict on December 10th, Graham gazed straight ahead without moving. His daughter, Naanique Graham, began to weep as jurors stood one by one to affirm the verdicts. The defense called no witnesses during the trial. Instead, John Murphy, his attorney, questioned several prosecution witnesses, particularly Looking Cloud, about conflicts between their testimony and previous statements. And now we go to a brief interview conducted by the Aboriginal Public Television Network from Winnipeg, Canada, where the questions will be written for each answer for you to see. News from Indian Country, or myself, mainly was part of a journalistic team that began reviewing the cases of Anime-Pictuaquash and Leonard Peltier in 1994, when members of the leadership of the American Indian Movement, Vernon, Clyde Belcourt, Dennis Banks, challenged Native journalists to review these cases and the alleged killings of other members of the American Indian Movement at Pine Ridge, South Dakota during the 70s. And so we assembled a team of about a dozen people within 2 or 3 years of reviewing the case files. There was 4 or 5 of us left, and near the end, probably at the end of the decade, turn of the century, there was myself, Minnie Two Shoes, a long-term member of the American Indian Movement, and then one of the most premier investigative Native journalists, Richard LaCourse, left reviewing the case as some of the most compelling revelations came to light through looking at the documents. I think it was an accumulation of a lot of things. We were pushing news articles out, asking lots of questions, reviewing documents, discovering liars, discovering evidence around the same time that Robert Ekefee became a U.S. Marshal, which actually provided access to some tools on the investigative end. And I think the era of fear, members of the American Indian Movement have been growing up, maturing, growing older. They got children and grandchildren. And I think the conscience speaks to people as they age. And I think people began realizing they needed to get these things off their chest. Many of them came to Native journalists. But I think what I'm most proud of is between the Native journalists that looked over this case and the Native investigators like Bob Ekefee or Mitch Purrier, Bureau of Indian Affairs law enforcement officer, which was significant in the conviction of John Graham, was that the Native community was involved in trying to bring this case to justice. You could have cut there. You could have dropped a pin and heard it. It was a mixed day in which we were notified. Debbie and Denise. I was with Anime Aquash's daughters when the prosecutors called initially at 4 o'clock and said there was a locked jury. By the time we got to the courthouse at 4:20, they said they had reached a verdict on one count, but they were locked on the other. And by 5 o'clock, when they had resolved the issue about whether they could miss trial on one charge and take the verdict on the other was resolved, the jury had come to a conclusion. What we didn't know that the jury at the time was that the jury had come to a conclusion that John Graham aided and abetted within the 4 hours of deliberation, and that the locking and the deliberations for another day and a half took place over the issue about whether or not he was the trigger man. So they believed the bulk of the evidence. They believed Arlo Looking Cloud, even though he had many stories. They also found that over the course of 35 years, he was consistent about 3 things. John Graham was with them when they tied Anime up in Denver, Colorado. John Graham was with Arlo Looking Cloud when they were in Rapid City, South Dakota, when Anime was interrogated. And John Graham was with them when he alleged that John Graham shot Anime. The jury acquitted John Graham on the premeditated murder or the triggerman charge because some people were unsure of those final moments. But he also, at the time of the sentence, is a life sentence, mandatory life without parole in state court that he's been convicted on. Well, we want to remember that we have 2 convictions, 1 guilty plea and 1 acquittal, and they still put Dick Marshall up there despite being acquittal. I have no doubt that after the prosecutors sit down and see where they are in this case, that the analysis is this. If John Graham had been acquitted, that would have been the end of this investigative case. Now with the guilty plea, they sealed Thelma Rios' testimony. She did not appear as a witness against John Graham in this trial. The question is what did she put in her sealed testimony? And I suspect that the prosecutors are going to analyze that and decide to move forward. And moving forward means they're going to get to the people who couried the messages and gave the order. And that points right to the entire leadership, frankly. It wasn't one individual who gave the order. It was most likely a consensus among the leadership that they had a problem, and they wanted this group of people to deal with that problem and resolved it, and they did. Thank you. And in other news today, the land claim settlement agreement between the state of New York and the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans stands on firm legal ground, according to John Echohawk, Executive Director of the Native American Rights Fund. The settlement, if joined by the U.S. Department of Interior, will resolve with finality Stockbridge's claim to more than 23,000 acres in central New York. The settlement will allow for state tribal cooperative processes to protect historical sites and authorize development of a resort and casino in Sullivan County, New York. Stockbridge-Munsee Chief Kimberly Veely said the fund's position validates their settlement. The Catskills project must still be approved by the Bureau of Indian Affairs of the Interior Department. Marshall McKay, tribal chairman of the Autry Nation, has been named chairman of the board of Autry National Center, founded by the late Gene Autry. McKay, an Autry trustee since 2008, brings a diverse background in business education, Native American tribal government, and the arts. Founded in 1988 as the Gene Autry Western Heritage Museum, the Autry National Center is now the original mostly cowboy museum, joined at the hip with the Southwest Museum of the American Indian, the oldest museum in Los Angeles, and the Women of the West Museum as well. Osage Nation officials are moving forward on economic development, said newly elected Chief John Red Eagle. The tribe broke ground during November on the Powhuska Business Development Center, the $1.8 million, 20,000 square foot facility, which will be a business incubator, will house classrooms for the Bartsville-based Tri-County Technology Center. Also, there will be space for startup businesses and manufacturing entities, according to Red Eagle. Any organization must have the internal structure established before there can be growth, Red Eagle said. The business incubator will be an investment to make a better community. The building is expected to open in the year 2011 and could spur business relationships for the nation, according to Red Eagle. And that is the latest roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update. We want to say miigwech for showing up. Come back again soon.